We're here today to talk about the pop culture in the 1920s. And this lesson is a lesson that we'll be going over in class and we'll be watching a video on, but it really helps to give us a good idea of what life was like in the 1920s. If we talk about the idea of traditional versus modern values, and if we talk about the fact that things are changing in the 1920s, really the pop culture or popular culture, what is popular among the average people, what we think of today as entertainment and sports, that is really what we're focusing on today in today's lesson when we talk about pop culture of the 1920s. So the first thing I want you to do is to answer the following question. What types of people do you follow or do you consider a celebrity today? I don't want people's names. I want you to tell me a little bit about the people, what you know about the people, what types of people are celebrities, and of course explain your answer. If you're doing this on Edpuzzle or Google Classroom, right now you can hit the next button and your question box will pop up and you can type the answer in there. So if we're going to take a look at pop culture, we're looking at popular culture. What is popular in the world at the time, and particularly what is popular in the United States at the time? And so we start out by looking at the Roaring Twenties. We know the 1920s was nicknamed the Roaring Twenties because things were happening. There was a lot of excitement. There was a lot of adventure. We see things happening, but those things are taking place in one particular part of the country, and that is in the big cities, in the urban areas. The 20s aren't really roaring in the rural areas. The rural areas in the 1920s are still pretty isolated. There's still farming communities. Farmers are still doing the farming thing. And so when we look at the Roaring 20s, we're mainly talking about urban areas because the rural areas, the farms, they found themselves pretty isolated at the time. But there was something that was going to change that. And of course, the invention that changes that is the radio. As radio becomes more popular, it serves as a medium to transfer information from the urban area to the rural areas. Prior to that, of course, you could read a newspaper or a magazine, but that really didn't help to bring celebrities to life to most people. Certainly people were reading magazines and newspapers, they were learning from them, but that wasn't really creating the modern way of life and the modern way of thinking that we will see once we get the radio. And so the radio really helps to connect urban and rural areas. It also creates more family bonding time. Families never used to sit around and read books together. Maybe they'd be reading on their own, but definitely not together. But now all of a sudden we've got radio and families can sit around and listen to programs. And much like you would watch dramas or action films on TV or at the movies today, you could do that on radio. There were radio shows that were dramatic. On top of that, you also had entertainment and news, and that was something else that was connected via the radio. And so with the rise of the radio and this ability to connect parts of the country, we also see a rise in celebrities. We see a rise in famous people. Sure, there were famous people before the 1920s, but the fandom, the fact that people started idolizing and worshiping these people, that doesn't really start to happen until the 1920s. And so some of the more famous people came from the world of sports. Some of the most popular sports at the time were baseball and boxing. You also had the growth of football and hockey and basketball at the time, but it was really baseball and boxing that were the two main sports in the 1920s. And so anybody who participated in these sports would have been quite famous. Of course, the entertainment movie, actors and actresses, whether it be on the movies, whether it be in theaters, or whether it be over the radio, these were famous people that the average day, everyday Americans started to worship and idolize. And finally, transportation heroes. We think of this kind of a little bit different today. Sort of maybe the only famous transportation hero you could name today is maybe Sully, the guy who landed the airplane on the Hudson River a few years ago. I know there was a recent movie made about him, but back in the day, if you were able to fly, that was something pretty remarkable, and especially the more talented pilots who flew around to the world or to famous parts of the world gained a lot of notoriety, and people would look up to them. And so you see in the photo a guy named Charles Lindbergh in his plane, the Spirit of St. Louis. you go to Henry Ford Museum, you can see a replica of the Spirit of St. Louis, but now we're going to find out a little bit more about Lindbergh in his life and how he got to be famous, as well as some other facts about other famous celebrities at the time, the rise of celebrities in the 1920s.
Then the Manasseh Mauler lashed out in his old ferocious style. Several fast, deadly punches.
In a decade fraught with so many changes, people in the 1920s seem hungry for old-fashioned heroes, and an explosion in spectator sports provided them. Sports giants became household names, their every move followed by radio and an eager tabloid press. One name was known in more households than any other.
In our family, we were never baseball-oriented, but I would have had to be deaf not to have heard about Babe Ruth.
George Herman Ruth, the Babe, reshaped America's pastime. In an era of big events, he excelled at the game's biggest excitement, the home run. He hit 60 of them in a single season in 1927, a record that would stand for 4 decades. Fans drove from miles around to see it. The public's fascination with flying in the 1920s seemed fitting for a time when even gravity couldn't hold down progress, and when every boundary seemed just waiting to be broken. In 1927, one pilot would put aviation and himself on every front page in the world. On a misty May morning outside New York City, a plane called the Spirit of St. Louis was ready to take off for Paris. No one had ever flown solo across the Atlantic before. 6 others had tried, failed, and died. Ready to take the chance this time was Charles Lindbergh, the 6'2" son of a former congressman from Minnesota. Thousands of people came to watch him take off. Once he was out of sight, it seemed as if all America held its breath.
In Yankee Stadium, they had 3 minutes of silence, praying for him. Everybody in the country was praying for him.
Flying the fuel-heavy single-engine plane was a battle against weather, hunger, and fatigue. For the entire 33.5-hour flight, the Western world wondered about the fate of that tiny plane somewhere over the vast Atlantic.
It was a Saturday night. They hadn't heard from him for a long time. And I was walking up 125th Street and someone shouted, "They found him." He was flying over Ireland, and within an hour or so, he landed in Paris.
100,000 Parisians were there to welcome the shy young pilot. Lucky Lindy emerged from his plane carrying only a razor and a passport. His flight had represented the best of an era, a mastery of modern technology joined with old-fashioned values of courage, individualism, and hard-won achievement.
If you're watching this at home, we're about to begin a video in class called Lindbergh Kidnapping. We're going to watch this in class if you're in class on time and on the right day. However, if you're absent, you'll need to make up this video, and I believe that there is a link on Moodle to get to the Lindbergh Kidnapping video. And again, as you're watching this, I want you to focus not so much on who Charles Lindbergh was, but the rise of celebrity, the rise of stardom, the fact that people are now becoming famous and the way their lives are being stalked, sort of like TMZ or Access Hollywood Today or even many of the internet sites. Look at the way that the media just went gaga over Charles Lindbergh and his family and how they wouldn't really leave him alone. This is sort of showing the rise of cult stars in the 1920s. So without further ado, if you're in class, we're going to watch the video, and if you are absent for class that day, then you can make up the video on Moodle. The end.